Hello, everybody. It's March 1st, 2023, and it's a day where we have interesting astrology, to say the least. We've got perfect conjunction with Mercury and Saturn. We've got conjunctions with Jupiter and Venus and Aries. If you're into asteroids, Chiron is getting in the mix as well. I don't know. There's something about all this where, okay, first of all, because Jupiter and Venus are the two benefics, obviously there's some good stuff going on with that, but I don't want to focus too much on that today. I kind of want to get more into the Mercury-Saturn stuff. And one of the things that I've noticed about Mercury-Saturn, anyways, is that I was watching Adam Ellenboss talk about this one, and there's something about that seemed familiar about the going to stuff that's kind of intellectual, or going to trying to like get an objective point of view on something, or trying to introduce maybe a more advanced kind of technique or something like this. Well, there's something about this whole what emerged out of this was that I didn't really. It just so happened that I started reading Cosmos and Psyche around the same time that I started reading the Anti-Oedipus. I think I might have probably started reading Cosmos and Psyche first. And then later on, I found Weird Studies, but I've been reading both of these books for a number of years, and I didn't read those two books with any sort of like intention to kind of combine the two or whatever, but it just sort of maybe indicates different influences on me in terms of how I look at things, and trying to reconcile those influences. And out of all that, though, however, there's just interesting things which kind of emerge out of that, because the whole connection with, let's say, Henri Bergson and Dane Rudhyar and stuff like this. I've been making a series of videos along those lines, and it's kind of because I was kind of approaching it too, this issue about capitalism, right? And, you know, politics and stuff, right? And there's a kind of this question I find when dealing with these kinds of things is, first of all, do I really want to focus on this in my channel? Is it even helpful for me to focus on this in my channel? Is it a good thing to do, or whatever? Or am I basically just, by addressing these kinds of political issues, am I just kind of inviting myself for more trouble to get dragged down, or to get sucked into the storm of bullshit, basically? I don't know how better to put it, right? But there's such a lot of that going around out now, but and that there's certain argument to be made for being more politically neutral, but then, however, there's something that I was sort of criticizing about there's an implicit kind of bias towards a certain kind of perspective, right? That is inherent, that it's never really neutral, right? And so this leads me to this issue that I've been thinking about, that I thought the Mercury-Saturn conjunction would be a good opportunity to approach this issue, which is, let me just unfurl this, because I've got it in my head, I've been thinking about this, that I was remembering this movie that it's kind of a cheesy conspiracy movie, but it's called Zeitgeist or whatever. But they had, one of the things in that movie they highlighted was this idea of ancient, like, sun religions and stuff like that. And it may be applicable, I mean, whatever, you don't have to get into unpacking everything about that movie, but this basic idea that, of the solar religion, right? And that the astrology obviously deals with the sun and the stars and all this kind of stuff. And there's the basic solar principle of the leader or the hero, and the Joseph Campbell hero myth and all this kind of stuff. Of course, there's something that Carl Jung talks about a lot when it comes to these kinds of hero myths, is the death of the hero, that inevitably the hero must fail or somehow integrate. Instead of slaying the dragon, you integrate the dragon, right? Rather than slaying it. And there's kind of the Jungian Jordan Peterson kind of territory kind of gets caught up on these kind of issues, or there's this whole masculine thing that seems to be creating a bit of friction anyways, where I was basically just kind of confused for a while because I was the kind of person who, when I was growing up, that I had different friends that I would hang out with, and there are certain friends that were really into Jungian stuff or whatever, and that they were very influential on me. But I never saw that sort of style of being into Jung and being into archetypes and being into all this kind of stuff as being fundamentally in conflict with the diversity and queer politics and all this kind of stuff. But since then, I'm not really in contact with these people anymore, and I don't even know what these people's their own views are on the subject, and that I've kind of live a kind of an isolated lifestyle where I'm trying to where over the years I've made new social connections, but the ones that I do make in this climate, it's frustrating for me because I've built a certain perspective on how I look at the world. And it's been disorienting times because now everybody I meet is like some weird alt-right person who likes Donald Trump and is like, I'm like, what? Why? I thought there were more people that had progressive views out there and I don't know if I'm just living my life in such a way where I am not in contact with those people, or that I have to only talk to them on the internet, or whatever, right? Like, that was kind of basically life frustration that drove me to being more kind of concerned about politics, because the basic social environment is like, you could basically just adapt your political views to your social environment and for needs of attachment and stuff. It also just feels whatever. I'm kind of getting off track here, but it is a part of it, right? A lot of people might feel like they get burnt from the left wing thing that they get, or people feel like outcast or ostracized, and they simply go to the right wing because it's more friendly towards them, right? And that it's sort of a friendly place for all the misfits and outcasts to go and then be resentful towards the woke moralists and stuff like that. But there's some issue anyways. I wanted to get into this stuff today. And one of the things I wanted to get into was the whole issue of the structure of things, right? Which has to do with this whole solar principle of light, right? And it's like, to be fair, I have to maybe I'll just lay the cards on the table here, because one of the influences here was this book, Christian Meditations on the Tarot, and I have to admit that I was reading the card on justice, and that it may be negligible how much justice is related to this Aquarius business, but it is Saturn. It was exalted in Libra. I mean, this guy doesn't even use that system of association, so it doesn't really matter. But the point is, there's a Saturn archetype present here, is what I'm trying to get at. Regardless of whether you associate Saturn with justice or not, there's this issue about what is good for humanity, right? And that if you think about how humanity is going to we have to resource our energy, resource our resources, whatever I'm trying to say. We're supposed to to different potential pursuits of what you're doing, and in order for a pursuit to be worthwhile, there's all these videos. Is it worth it? Which is like what is it worth? What? How much money you're investing? How much time you're investing? Like, worth it? People basically, is it worth it? Things are only worth it in so much as there's a payoff. In that it's worth it because it's useful for me. That it has a kind of a utilitarian value, right? And so from taking this kind of approach has sort of created a kind of a society where our idea of what is good is usually, it seems to be tied up with this utilitarian thing, where things that are good are things that are useful, and that things that are not useful, they may not necessarily be bad, but they're not definitely good in the same way. But the whole point of that point of being utilitarian is that they fulfill they do something relative to a certain context, relative to the needs. Who are they useful for? They're useful for someone, right? And so the person who it's useful for decides that it's useful, decides that it's good, right? And then, but what happens though is that for everything that's useful and for everything that's good, there's things that may not be useful, or there are things that could even be straight up dangerous, right? Or be hazardous or something like this, right? That may be destructive, that would be there's certain things that are like, there might be a certain kind of a poisonous plant or something, and to say that the plant is good or bad is sort of like besides the point. But if you're looking at the context of like, should I eat this plant? Should I cook this plant for dinner? No, in that context, the plant is a bad choice to make dinner with, right? But if you're going to use that plant for some other purpose, maybe it was useful in a specific context, right? And it was an interesting thing. I've heard some people, there's like a guy on the Duncan Trussell show that was making this kind of point about pharmaceuticals and drugs, is that there's an attitude demonizing or antagonizing the pharmaceutical industry, and this guy was basically saying, look, that there's no such thing as a good drug or a bad drug. All there is there's a situation where this thing could be either helpful for you, or it could be not helpful for you, or it's just inappropriate. It's not the right thing to use in the situation, or it is the right thing to use in the situation, right? And then whether or not something is, so that's the thing, is whether or not something is good or bad in this sense is entirely subjective, not really on the thing itself, but for the intended purpose or use, and whether in its utilitarian function, right? Now, I mean, this is all well and good for a certain thing, but it kind of leaves a certain room open where that things don't quite fall into this category. And, one of my influences is J.F. Martel, and he did this course on art talking about how Oscar Wilde would, say that art is fundamentally useless. Like, art isn't a utilitarian thing, but we see art as being good because art has beauty, and that beauty is not just there to be utilitarian. There's the idea of something that is a transcendental good, a transcendental beauty, and a transcendental truth, which is that is beyond all level of utilitarianism, right? And this is kind of a metaphysical approach. I mean, there's different ways to take this, but okay. But a thing about, aside from the art thing, let's forget about art, but let's look at basic like moralism, right? The basic moralism of things that are. I'm not going to go. There's certain things that are obviously, like, going around murdering people is obviously not good, and that it's good. I would say it's good to have rules and stuff like that, like Saturn. This is the whole thing. At some point in time, you need some sort of a penal system or means of control or punishment or something like this, because there's I think we can all agree that we don't want people just going around murdering people, robbing people, being barbarians. There being chaos and violence. This is not really the society that we want. So we want some kind of control over things, basically. And so basically we have a system of controls in place where have it really conditioned into us that there are some things which we are completely off limits that we can't do, but whether those things are in themselves objectively this is the whole thing, but what makes that morally good or not is usually defined is that are the things that we're doing helpful or productive for our society, mainly being human society, and are the things, or are they harmful or hazardous to our human society? Now, the issue, though, about this is that when we define it so strictly in things that are good for humans, then you could easily have a situation where, environmental problems crop up, because there could be something like, if we mine this mineral and we harvest it in such a way with maximum efficiency so that the human being can profit off of it and utilize it to make it useful to the greatest extent, then what is good is how to maximize that efficiency. And then if there are any harmful outcomes that affect other creatures, such as animals or plant life or other environmental factors, that doesn't really matter, because we're mainly just concerned about humans, right? And then, so this is kind of what I think should be obvious here, is that, let's say, let's say your mine starts poisoning the water that goes into where the salmon spawn, and now the fish are poisoned, and now you're relying on the fish for your food supply, and now your people are poisoned because you didn't consider the fact that this thing that looks like it's separate from you, that is actually very, like, your whole diet is built off of it. So you're basically screwing yourself over because you didn't consider that the fish was part of the picture, right? And this is basically where I bring in why I think Deleuze and Guattari is relevant, right? Is because in Deleuze and in their whole series of books about capitalism and schizophrenia, one of the basic ideas they talk about is, if you think about plants, and specifically the process of bumblebees pollinating flowers is a good example, right? Because you have kind of a symbiotic relationship formed between the bumblebee and the flower in such a way that it's obvious that the way that the flower's reproductive cycle is entirely dependent on the bumblebee, and that the bumblebee, so they kind of, and what the bumblebee does to collect pollen, it does something for the bumblebee and also does something for the flower, right? And that you could look at this as being two discrete organisms that have their own thing going on, that a bumblebee is a bumblebee and a flower is a flower, and they're the most different things in the world, and it would take an idiot to mistake them for being the same thing, of course, right? And so we all know this, that a bumblebee is not a flower and a flower is not a bumblebee. And yet the thing, though, is you could not have the flowers without the process of the bumblebee, right? And that you could not have the bumblebees without the process of collecting the pollen to make honey and stuff like this. And there's an interdependence, right? And so in the sense, but there's this kind of philosophical argument that being interdependent is not the same thing to say that there are the same being. They're not the same being, but in some way it depends on how you look at it, right? Because if we zoom out, if we could either look at the whole, if we look in a point of view of wholeness, we could look at the ecosystem on Earth as a single unit, which is called Gaia, the kind of the organic life on planet Earth. And in the same way that the bee and the flower are both discrete entities, but are also engaged in a larger interdependent process, that, this is a pretty basic environmental systems theory stuff, but this is, Deleuze calls this partial objects, in that there is a larger object that is made up of these partial objects, and there's a kind of a network that forms between. And then we're all online and stuff, so we should be used to this stuff, right? But the whole idea here about, I don't like talking about transhumanism, because I feel like when you get into transhumanism, too much of it seems to be associated with technological transhumanism, like leaving behind the human body and just becoming robots. And I'm not sure if I'm comfortable with that idea. And but like, there's this, the basic principle though, is that if you understand that your food supply is its own beings with its own needs, with its own thing going on, and that your life is dependent on this, which is dependent on this, which is dependent on this, is that when you're building this sort of you're building an outlook, a structure of a way to think about the world that we're in, but it's all built on, which is, it's, you can call it the ego, right? Which is basically identified, like, I'm identified as being a human being, and it's me against the world. This is pretty basic 1960s Alan Watts environmentalist kind of stuff, right? That to see yourself as a whole and not as a one man trying to conquer the world and all this kind of stuff. But if you go back and read old literature from white guys in Europe, it kind of sounds like they're all have this attitude, like they gotta impose their masculine ego on the world and conquer everything. It is kind of like it is a thing, right? And where am I going with all this? I think there's something about Aquarius, Mercury and Saturn and Aquarius, where we have these structures that are built up that are basically, if you look at Aquarius is like the cupbearer, Ganymede, the cupbearer, to be in service to the king, to make personal sacrifices to serve the king, which is to serve the leader, which is to serve the solar ego, which has the vision of what is good for the kingdom, which is good, leading the whole group, the tribe, and all this. But the whole thing, though, is that we have a certain structure in place where that led to all this awful stuff like fascism, right? Because I'm reading a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism by Wilhelm Reich, which was one of the influences on Deleuze and Guattari for doing Anti-Oedipus, and it's very illuminating to look at Wilhelm Reich kind of criticize Nazi ideology, because, the Nazis thought they had this kind of romantic kind of idea that they were descendants, that like there's like the Greek and the Romans being like the original bearers of Western civilization, and that, but it was kind of funny because they saw it as there being like these, that there was the good Greek gods, and then there were the bad Greek gods that were contaminated from these outside influences of these cults. But this is the kind of the basic kind of bias that this way of thinking has had, is that there's some sort of pure, clean, holy, virtuous thing that needs to be protected from these corrupting outside influences. And what's funny about the Nazis is they actually saw certain god, like Dionysius is a good example, where they saw Apollo versus Dionysus, that Apollo is the good, Dionysus is the bad. But then what ends up happening, though, is that, like Wilhelm Reich argues, that they would throw these big balls and have those big, the beer hall rallies and stuff like that. And they had the Nazis had a Dionysian side, and they know how to use it. But they took all of the judgments against whatever alcoholism and partying and being expressive, and basically codified that as a kind of a shadow judgment to project on the inferior people that we need to go and kill, and then never mind, and then kind of like gloss over it when we do it and have fun. But basically see in a way that you can sort of, all the stuff you don't feel uncomfortable has been conditioned into you as seeing as some sort of bad thing. Then this is what happens, though, if you look at what happens, I think, with black culture in the States, is that white people have this idea of what is supposed to be clean and pure and virtuous, and we have this idea of a kind of, like jazz music and funk music and all this kind of and rock and roll is always supposed to represent something that is sort of like dirty and uncivilized and unclean. And so it's always the black people which are the musicians. I mean, you could also just say that the black people are naturally just talented and all this kind of stuff. And but there's something about, what I'm trying to suggest, though, is that it's been shaped by this coding where it's almost like, I feel like the culture has been pushed this way, where there's all this stuff that, now, of course, white people get to have fun with it and participate in it, but we have this kind of privilege where we're sophisticated, intellectual, higher mind people that rise above the lower impulses of, but we have the same impulses, but we just get to have the identity of not being associated with it because the structure of white supremacy, basically, right? I don't know. And people don't like this kind of stuff because they'll call it all woke moralism or whatever. But there's something about reading old literature and stuff like that where I do think it's relevant. And my whole point of view is that I don't want to. I don't know. My whole point of view is that I personally don't see anything wrong with saying that I'm supporting whatever, anybody who calls themselves Black Lives Matter or is for, it's just pretty typical, like, white, liberal, nice guy stuff or whatever. It's not that controversial of a thing to do, but I'm kind of take that position. And I can see it, though, is that I can bring it into the astrology, and it being this kind of thing about how we built up such a fixed structure that basically says these things are what is good and these things which are bad, and then we project all that bad stuff onto other people, even if it's the stuff that we like, even if it's the stuff that we enjoy, right? And that out of this kind of thing, what I've noticed is that out of the same thing is that when I'm trying to navigate my life and navigate my decisions, our whole culture is kind of coded in a way, which is like, what's the good choice or what's the bad choice? Like, is it good to, like, it's always good to be what would the straight well-to-do white guy do, and what would the ne'er-do-well immigrant do, or something like, you know what I'm saying? It's like we've coded the good family man white guy. This is what goodness looks like, and then everything else is scary and threatening to that, right? But that's created this. That's kind of one of the things that in my astrology, I've always just felt the need to challenge this, right? Like, it's just as an intuitive thing. There's something off with this. That there's and that astrology itself represents something which I think there's a huge popularity of black astrology, because particularly because it's something that has been denigrated and cast out, and that it's people like. Personally, I even got more attracted to it after I had gone through a number of years of being alienated from being in the psych system and something like that. And for people that are kind of alienated and disenfranchised, it's kind of like, oh, well, you don't take us seriously? And you don't take astrology seriously? Well, look, what a good opportunity. We can just cozy up with astrology. We can cozy up to all this stuff that you guys don't take seriously, because you guys know what's best for humanity. You guys know, because you guys are the master race. You guys really know, you guys have all the bright ideas, you know, science and technology, and you know that all this stuff that we're into is just infantile, childish bullshit that you need to leave behind, because you are the master, superior people that we need to look up to and follow no matter what, and all those kind of, it's like, yeah, it's like, and that's kind of what our structure is, right? And that the whole part of wokeness, though, is wokeness is like, once the system of thought kind of recognizes that that's actually happening, that you can start to develop a kind of metacognition where you realize your own biases, where you realize your own blind spots, your own structural problems, and you just have to kind of self-correct for that. And we're kind of like in the middle of that process right now culturally, and I could probably, maybe making a video like this is kind of dumb, right? Because I don't know if this is going to win, like, I mean, I'm not trying to virtue signal here. I'm just trying to lay it out, what I'm doing with my kind of political project. If that's what you want to call it. Like, is that just to do... And this all goes together with the astrology. Unfortunately, one of the things that I am kind of concerned about is that when we have Saturn ingressing into Pisces, there are certain things which might come up, like a certain kind of intolerance, where people have these, like, Saturn represents a structure, and that you could be intolerant to people who do not fit inside the structure, or that you take the structure too seriously, or else it could also be weird, where you could have weird things happening where the hypocrisies and the inconsistencies of the structure start to show, or that there's a kind of a slipperiness with Pisces where the structure kind of gives out into the other thing, or something like this, right? There's all sorts of things about these structures that I'm talking about that could be tested, and ultimately Pisces almost has a kind of like psychedelic acid quality. There could be these years where Saturn is in Pisces could have this kind of effect of like the psychedelic acid corroding and dissolving away at the Saturn structure, right? Which is nothing to be careful about. But there's certain issues with Saturn and Neptune and Pisces that I could foresee, like being, one of them could be religious intolerance. It could be the separation of church and state. I've already started to see some of that come up in the news, but there's people that, it's like, the whole thing about the control of Saturn is that sometimes it's good to have these controls, and it's not the separation of church and state. Like, you can be a non-dualist, or whatever you want to say. You can be this person who is like, sees it integrated with their spiritual life, their consciousness with what they do in the world. But it's important that because we live in a multicultural society, that there's a certain cultural subjectivity inherent in religion and spirituality, and that when we are dealing in the civic sphere, we need a form of objectivity, that we can't just rely on our subjective beliefs when we're dealing with the civic sphere, because there's no guarantee. The whole point of the civic sphere is that we're trying to reach a democratic synthesis, or a democratic, conclusion based on a number of people who have different subjective viewpoints, and that treat your religion as if it is objective, and then bring it into the civic, political sphere, you're only going to have trouble, and you're going to, if you see things in such black and white, like if you see the structure that has been laid down by the good book, by the scripture, as being a black and white just word of God, and you're going to go in there in politics and you're going to treat it like that, you're basically like the crazy Muslim fundamentalists, right? Or like you're going to be imposing religious laws on people, because that Saturn is important to have there to create a distinction between the world of politics and the world of religious life, and there's similarities, but if you try to put those two things together, you're going to have a kind of an oil and water effect in this. It's not going to work out very well. This is one of the things that we have to worry about with Saturn in Pisces. Saturn, Neptune in Pisces. Yeah. And so as I'm getting into this, I don't even know, man. Like maybe, I don't know what, maybe I should just back off of the political stuff. Maybe I should be careful not to unleash any esoteric occult secrets on humanity. But like, there's this. Where I'm going with all this too is I'm basically one of the principles with my astrology has always been like whether or not trying to market myself by saying what I'm doing is something that was going to be useful for you or something like that. Is that I honestly don't know if it's going to be useful or not. It's for me, it's more of like journey into the unknown, to explore, to learn, to be curious, and there could very well be things that come out of astrology which may not be helpful, right? Like you could just be like, you could find something like there's entirely possible that if you like, I don't know if I would agree with people wanting to divine their own death or something like that. You could go to an astrologer and be like, tell me when I'm going to die, or tell me how I'm going to die, and then the person would be like, oh shit, looks like you've only got 6 months according to this, or whatever, like you'd be freaked out. You're like, oh, I thought I'd had 30 years, oh my god, or something. There's things like that where it's like, whether is that helpful or is that just fucking you up, or is it even true, right? What if the person got it wrong and you just you take it serious? There's all these can of worms issues with astrology, and when it comes to having structure and control and limitations and boundaries and stuff, it's a good thing to have those, right? When Saturn goes into Pisces, though, I feel like there's something that's going to happen where those kinds of boundaries are going to be pushed, they're going to be tested, you're going to maybe do things where like, maybe I should have said no, or maybe I know better not to do this, but why am I doing it anyways, or something like that, or getting like, or like I shouldn't have done this, but now I'm already in it and there's no going back. Like it's already too late to go back. I've already, I can't unsee what I've seen, kind of thing. There's all these kind of factors that could come in with Saturn and Pisces, I feel like. And so there we go. There's half an hour. I don't know. Is there anything else I wanted to talk about before I wind this one up? I don't know. I'm just considering. It's something you don't see on YouTube very much. Long, thoughtful pauses, right? I don't even know. And then maybe that's something we need more of with Saturn and Pisces. Long, thoughtful pauses, right? Yeah, who knows? Whatever. Hopefully you like this one. Hopefully there's something worthwhile in this for you. I don't know.